Hey, this is Brian Regan calling for Ali.
Ali, yes, speaking. Hey, Brian, how's it going?
Great, how are you?
Good, doing well. I wanted to start with language, Brian, since it's a big part of your act. I heard you once say that your first experience with comedy was you seeing a funeral procession and asking your dad if he had ever seen a real life dead man before, and uh, and your dad couldn't stop laughing, and that's when you realized the oddness of language. I was curious from that point on, how did you develop that sensitivity to language that you're known for, or did you find that it came naturally?
Oh, wow. Words are very important, and I was always interested in how George Carlin felt the same way. George Carlin always talked about words and how important words were. So, as far as my act, I'm thinking this through as you're asking it because part of it feels like it's natural to me to want to pick a more interesting word. But I know that in my comedy, I also apply a craft to it and that I go out of my way to try to find a more interesting word to convey something. For example, like if I come up with a joke and the idea of the joke works, I might try it on stage and go, okay, the idea of that joke worked. Then the next day I will say, what is a more interesting way to say that? Are there words that will pop better than what I said the previous night? And it's, I like knowing the fact that there's a huge dictionary filled with thousands and thousands of words. Why not try to use them?
Yeah, yeah. It's so. Do you like? I know one thing you do is you kind of try and take words and then interpret them literally, and then sometimes that makes them funny. Sometimes you kind of use words that don't make sense next to each other, and you put them next to each other. Do you have like a catalog of patterns that you kind of have in the back of your head and that you look for?
Um, no, I try to resist figuring out how to do comedy because I want it to be coming from different perspectives, even the style of comedy. There are jokes that I do where I want to be the naive person in the joke. And then there are other jokes where I want to be the smart observer in the joke. And so I never want my audience to feel like they can figure out a pattern. I want to be able to do one joke that is an observational joke, and then the next joke to be something silly and offbeat that doesn't fit with the previous joke. And I find that it's more fun for me to do it that way. And I find that it keeps an audience engaged. You know, they can't figure out a pattern. I don't want it to be a pattern, and I don't want the audience to figure out a pattern.
Yeah, I love that phrase you use, the smart observer. I've heard you use it before in interviews, and and I was curious, like, did that come about as a reaction to people trying to pigeonhole you, or was it always kind of your intention to have that be your onstage persona?
When I first started to become kind of known, if you will, I remember our early articles about me focusing on he's the dumb guy, he plays the dumb guy, he's the victim. And that was true. But I didn't want the comedy to be only from that perspective. I wanted people to realize that I am aware that I feel dumb.
Mm.
I don't want to be naive. I don't want the person on stage to be a naive person that the audience laughs at. I want the person on stage to be cognizant enough to know what I'm experiencing. Yes, I might feel dumb, but I'm aware of it. And then I moved beyond the feeling dumb jokes to being the observer who makes fun of other people who might be dumb. I don't want to be the only dumb guy in the world in my comedy.
Yeah.
There are other people who need to be made fun of as well. One of my favorite compliments after a show, obviously comedians want people in the audience to think that their stuff is funny, and that's a tremendous compliment. But one of the compliments that I really enjoy hearing is, wow, a lot of what you did was new. So they were hearing stuff that they hadn't seen me do before. I want it to be funny as well, but I like knowing that it's new, and under the umbrella of new, hopefully I'm hitting things from a perspective that they weren't familiar with.
I think it was the Netflix special that I watched, where I felt like there was a lot of new material there, like things that I'd not seen you do before. So I saw you kind of talk about topical events like the war in the Middle East and kind of that, like political stuff I'd not seen you kind of touch on. But even when you did that, I felt it was masterful because it was so balanced and it didn't kind of split the room, which I think is a gift that you have. Is that kind of I'm curious kind of what goes into the writing process or the editing process to kind of ensure that your comedy, even when it veers into the topical or the potentially divisive, everyone's still laughing and enjoying themselves.
Well, I appreciate that very much. I never want someone in my audience to say to themselves, I wish I had not come tonight. I don't ever want to belittle anyone's point of view. That doesn't mean I don't have a point of view, and I like to hint at where I stand on things, but I don't want it to go so far as to I don't want, my point isn't to have people agree with me. My point is to have people understand that there are different ways of looking at things, and if we can all laugh at something, no matter what side you're on, hopefully that's cathartic. I'm doing jokes lately in my act about guns, and right when I bring up the topic, I can feel the audience pulling back, like, "Oh boy, where is he going with this?" And one of my jokes that doesn't get as big of a laugh as I would like, but it means something to me, is I say I'm the only person I know in the middle on guns. And I say, in fact, I went to a convention for people in the middle on guns, and I was the only one in the ballroom. And I just do a visual of a guy just standing there by himself, having a cocktail, looking around, and nobody's in the room. And I like it because I feel like it makes a statement. It's like the pro-gun and the anti-gun people are obviously louder, and everyone knows about them, but there are people who are kind of on the line, and they exist as well, but they don't get the attention. Yeah,
agreed. So Brian, you mentioned George Carlin earlier, and I read somewhere that he was an influence on you. I think you and Carlin are excellent at shining a light on the absurdity of language. So Carlin had his that soft language routine that I think is timeless. One difference between you and Carlin is that I feel you never tell the audience what to think, whereas Carlin was more of a critic, maybe even a cynic sometimes about the world. So was that an intentional choice on your part to kind of focus on describing the world as it is versus making a case for how it ought to be?
Well, in some ways I do, at least in terms of etiquette and behavior. I think I try to push in there the way I think things ought to be in terms of human behavior. I wish we were all considerate of each other, and I like to poke fun of boorish behavior. But yeah, it's always been an interesting, I don't know, my whole career, I've always wondered, well, what am I doing on stage? Am I trying to teach? Am I trying to have people think what I think? At the end of the day, obviously, it's just to make people laugh, but that's such a wide net. You know, of course, every comedian wants everybody to laugh in the audience, but I like people to feel good. You know, there's a difference between laughing at and laughing with. And I've always preferred the laughing with kind of comedy. I never liked the kind of comedy where there's 10 people in a circle and one person makes fun of one person in the circle and 9 people laugh, but the person who was made fun of isn't. And they don't feel good, and it hurt that person. I don't like that kind of comedy, even though 90% are laughing at it. I want everybody laughing, even the person you're talking about. Growing up, my dad was a very loving man, but he was a very funny man, and he was that way. Like, he could make light of people, but in a way that they laughed and felt good. Once you cross the line into making fun of somebody where they don't also laugh, that I've never been into that.
I hear you. Yeah, I think that's why it's so universal, at least for English-speaking audiences. Which brings me to another question, Brian. Do you know if your work has been translated?
Well, that's interesting. I've never really looked into that. I've never. I think it's something that I would like to try to figure out, how people respond to it, and when it's translated into another language. It is fun. Occasionally, I'll be doing a show and there's a signer who is signing to a person who can't hear, and I know certain jokes are like puns or whatever, and I'm curious, well, how do you translate a pun in sign language, And I remember one time I'm on stage, and there's a signer on stage, a woman off to my right, and she's signing to a person in the audience, and I'm doing something where I'm making like a really goofy face in the joke, and I remember wondering, I wonder what she's doing. And I looked over at her, and she was just pointing at me. It's like, he's like, I'm not going to try to duplicate this. Look at his face. And I found that so funny. I was like, okay, that's one way to interpret it. Just point at the guy making the silly face.
Just look at the comic,
Yeah.
Brian, do you improvise at all on stage? I feel like your act is so well scripted, and sometimes when things are so well scripted, they feel like they're improvised. But do you improvise at all on stage?
A little bit, not that much. I do like to not know how I'm getting from one chunk to the next. If I do 5 minutes on sports or I don't necessarily want to know where I'm going after that, so that the transition is natural and real. I always want to make sure that I'm in the moment on stage. When I'm telling the jokes, of course, but the moments in between. I see acts sometimes, and I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but sometimes, like, I'll watch a comedian and I feel like they're reciting. They're like they're reciting their memorized show to the audience, and I feel like they're not getting as much out of it as they could. Whereas when you're saying something on stage, you want to make it feel like you're saying it for the first time, even though you may have said it 1,000 times. And as far as improvising, that's why I try to have enough moments in there where I do have to improvise to be real and in the moment. And I think people are drawn into somebody actually being there in front of them.
Are there things that you've taken out of your act, Brian, either because they didn't work or you had second thoughts about them? I remember, I think I forget which interview it was, where you said that you would tape your earlier shows, like early in your career.
Yeah. I've, I've had jokes from years ago. When I first started, I've always tried to be kind and a good person. But when I first started, I was kind of naive and not realized that certain things that I were saying might be hurtful to people. Even though in my mind, something might just be silly or goofy. But so I have dropped some things over the years where I'm like, even if something gets a laugh, if it's hurting someone, it's not worth it, So I was telling my girlfriend the other day that I had a joke a long time ago, and I did kind of like an over-the-top, stereotypical Asian-like accent. And the comedian friend was doing a guest set, Henry Cho, and when we got off stage, he was like joking with me, making fun of the fact that I was doing this accent. And he goes, when are you going to drop that out of your act? And I did. I was like, you know what? Yeah, you don't want cheap, easy stuff. You want it to be earned, and and then when you realize, well, maybe somebody could be offended by that accent, so I'll drop it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's awesome. And then one last question, Brian. Did you ever think when you were starting out that you would end up many decades later at a place where you've influenced so many comedians and had such a kind of impact on people?
Certainly not when I started. No. I hope to be able to make a living at it. When I first started, my fantasy was to be able to go around the country and do comedy, and if they would give me $100 at the end of the night, I'd be set. And so that was my goal, was to get to where I could make $100 doing my comedy. And then along the way, I was fortunate enough to develop a following amongst fans, which is great, but to have the respect of my peers means the world to me. It means that, gosh, I must be doing something right. And it's incredibly rewarding to do something and find out that other people who do what you do tip their hat your way. And it's a very, very satisfying feeling.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful for your work, Brian, and I've really enjoyed this conversation, and it's just great to hear about kind of your perspective on various things. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed it very much. You have a terrific day.